Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Sarah, and I'm a bookseller at Politics and Prose, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, please line up with the microphone to ask your questions next to the podium. Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Elon Green, celebrating the release of The Man Nobody Killed: Life, Death, and Art in Michael Stewart's New York. Elon Green has written for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and appears in Unspeakable Acts, Sarah Weinman's anthology of true crime. Last Call: A True Story of Love, Lust, and Murder in Queer New York was the first book that he wrote and won the Edgar Award for Best Fact Crime. Green was an executive producer on the HBO series adapted from Last Call. Green will be in conversation with Nicole Chung. Chung is the author of the award-winning memoir, A Living Remedy, which was named a notable book by the New York Times and a best book of the year by over a dozen other outlets. Her 2018 debut, All You Can Ever Know, was a bestseller and finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. So please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Elon Green and Nicole Chung.
Hey. I think it's the biggest crowd I've ever gotten. It's not funny.
Thank you all so much for being here. It's lovely to see you. And Elon, thank you for inviting me to be in conversation with you.
I mean, it's honestly just a thrill for me because I've known Nikki for a long time and she was my editor.
That's right.
And I don't know.
I can't believe we haven't done this before,
You
actually.
write.
But
I would like to write as beautifully as you do someday.
well, I mean, I think you've done it with this book, which is a hard but really compelling and beautiful read. You're going to start off by reading a little bit for us, yeah?
Oh, yes.
You just take the display copy.
Okay. So this will be from the prologue, since that's really the only part of the book that'll make sense to you. Not long after midnight on September 15th, 1983, Michael Stewart telephoned Patricia Pesci. He didn't know her all that well, as they'd spent only a few hours together a couple of weeks before at Lucky Strike, a bar in the East Village where her sister was DJing. Michael was 25, 4 years younger than Patricia. A slender man, nearly 6 feet tall, he was black and unusually handsome, with wide-spaced eyes and a palpable air of thoughtfulness. His short locks often carried a scent of the coconut oil he used to style them. When he spoke, it was only after careful deliberation. His quiet and unassuming way of moving through the world was in crisp contrast to the loud, brash circus of early 80s Manhattan, with its melange of assertive personalities, each striving to be the most colorful in the room. Ironically, what might have made Michael recede elsewhere, here in New York, made him stand out. When you saw him, his quietness drew you in. With his friends, he was sweet and playful, knowledgeable about fashion, art, and especially music, all pursuits that made his particular corner of New York City tick. Michael rented a studio in Lower Manhattan where he made art, but he also did some DJing and modeling and a little dancing for the Odd Video Project, while working less glamorous gigs on the side. A cobbled-together life, very common in the early 80s downtown scene. During the first hangout at Lucky Strike, Michael had shown Patricia his latest art project, which involved pages and pages of black and white contact sheets on which he'd drawn with marker. Years later, she'd recall that as they walked a few blocks near St. Mark's Place, snow had unexpectedly fallen on the city. Pesci hadn't expected to ever see Michael again, but then he called her on what would turn out to be his final good night. but when he called her on what would turn out to be his final good night, she agreed to meet him at the Pyramid Club. When she arrived, he had already been there for a while after a failed attempt to crash a party at the home of Keith Haring. The artist, skinny and bespectacled, and also 25, had spent the past years dotting the city's walls and subway cars with chalked and painted works faster than they could be erased. Pesci arrived at the loud, grimy, eclectic, electric East Village Club and snaked her way through the crowd to order a drink. A slight woman, dressed that night all in black, she followed Michael to the basement, the domain of the staff and regulars. The first night they'd hung out, Michael had been quiet. Conversations with sweet Michael, Pesci would observe, meant that you did most of the talking. Tonight, as they sat together on a couch, he was unusually chatty. Michael took a sip from Pesci's drink of rum and orange juice and shared his excitement. He'd gotten a spot DJing at Lucky Strike, and he just modeled on a shoot for a magazine. As the two talked, he found a cowrie shell on the couch and gave it to Pesci. She'd later think of this as an omen. All told, they were together in the club for about an hour and 15 minutes. After leaving the Pyramid, the two walked a block west and then perched on a tenement stoop to talk further. The night was chilly. Noticing Pesci's discomfort, Michael offered her his top layer. "I'm going to show you my shirt," he told her. The shirt underneath was designed by Peter Key, an up-and-comer in the fashion world. Everybody has been trying to see it all day. They sat for a while longer and smoked. Michael said he was going to have his own show. If you were an aspiring artist then, the solo show was the landmark event you aimed for. Just the year before, Haring had had one at the Tony Shafrazi Gallery, and it had vaulted him forward toward fame, and fame as much as money was the hungry aim of the time. As Haring put it during a characteristically clear-eyed interview about where he wanted to go and what it would take to get there, when you go to the top of the Empire State Building and look around at how many lights there are, I think I could work my ass off my whole life and never make a dent. I would like to get in everybody's house. Jean-Michel Basquiat, a friend of Haring's and an acquaintance of Michael's, had also been gaining fame since René Ricard's bombshell essay about him in Art Forum. Michael was young too. He was born nearly 2 years before Basquiat and 5 days after Haring. There was still time to catch up. The pair walked a few more blocks. Michael debated going to a club on West Broadway, but it was late. He had recently moved back into his parents' house in Brooklyn, and it was time to get home. At First Avenue, he and Pesci hailed a taxi. Pesci, who lived on 82nd Street on the Upper East Side, offered to drop Michael off at the LL, the train he'd take out of Manhattan. Once they reached the station at 14th Street and First Avenue, Michael tried to give Pesci some money for the cab. Before he got out of the car, Pesci kissed him on the cheek and said, "See you tomorrow. Speak to you tomorrow." It wasn't yet 3 a.m. when Michael exited the taxi. He waved, then disappeared down the subway steps. This would be the last time anyone who cared about Michael would see him alive and well.
Thank you so much for the reading. And I'm glad you read the prologue, not just because, as you said, it's the part of the book that you can just drop them right into without context. But I love that you started the book with Michael Stewart himself, sort of introducing him to us. Can you talk a little bit more about who he was, what he was trying to accomplish, like what was most important to him? Who was he really trying to become before his death at 25?
I mean, I think like just about everybody in the East Village, certainly, you know, he was just trying to make it. I mean, when you're 25 years old, unless you're a phenom like Basquiat or Haring, then you're all potential. You're all aspirations. And, you know, while there were a number of exceptional things about Michael, including, his looks, he was gorgeous. Um, he was a striver like everybody else, just more quiet about it.
Why is that where you decided to open the story? Like on that last, you called it the last good night.
Because the book gets violent and brutal. And I've always thought that whether it was this book or my first one, Last Call, if you don't appreciate the way the deceased is when they're alive and well and happy, then you're not really going to fully feel the impact of their death.
I remember the first thing you ever said to me about this book. You might not remember, but you were texting me about it. And what you said was you couldn't believe no one had written this book yet. Like no one had written about Stewart's life and death before, at least not at this length, not to this level of reporting and research. What was sort of the initial spark or, idea that made you feel like you had to write this story?
I think, well, the initial spark was really I started to talk to the witnesses to the beating, and these were all freshmen at the Parsons School of Design on the west side of Union Square, and all of them said some version of, what took so long. All these people had been holding in this story for nearly 40 years, and were just waiting for somebody to give a shit. And but as for the larger scope of the book, once I kept noticing that, like, at every turn, some remarkable or notorious figure was involved in the story. I mean, not even indirectly, but directly. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I don't think it would really be possible to find another story that ropes in, Robert Morgenthau, Ed Koch, Madonna, serial bombers, the United Freedom Front, Bernard Goetz, and Eleanor Bumpers. It's just like sort of the ultimate Manhattan story, in a way.
You point out, maybe in other interviews that I read, this Michael Stewart's death, his beating and his trial kind of laid the foundation for how we understand cases of police brutality. It's still like referred to. It's part of this like terrible heritage that you mentioned other names just now. But this is one of the first really well publicized attempts to hold law enforcement to some account, right? To say you have to exercise some care for the safety of people taken in. Talk about why you think this particular case was one that grabbed kind of the public attention the way that it did.
I would say that the point at which it really took a turn into a national story, not just a tabloid story, which it became pretty quickly because a TV news journalist named Gabe Pressman was obsessed with it. And if he was obsessed with a story, then just about every other reporter in the city was going to follow his lead. He, by the way, like, invented the job. There was no such thing as a TV news reporter until he started doing it. But it became a national story once the police were indicted, because although it had happened before, it still shocked just about everybody, including the police themselves.
I realize that it isn't in the prologue, which makes sense, and you referred to the violence, but not in detail. But if you want to briefly describe kind of like what happened to Michael on the last night of his life, and like what sort of where you even began kind of reporting that out for the book.
So where the prologue leaves off, him walking down into the subway, what ends up happening is that a transit police officer who's come on shift there allegedly catches him defacing the subway wall with a marker. I say allegedly because I've never talked to anyone who's seen photos of it, and it wasn't, as far as I could tell, offered into evidence later at trial. But that was the catalyst for the confrontation. He is quickly arrested, and rather than taking him to District 4, which was the precinct in Union Square, he ends up in Union Square surrounded by 11 transit police. And possibly the catalyst for the violence that follows is because he attempted to flee. Understandably, it's 2:30, 3 a.m. in the morning, and at the time, Union Square was not well lit, and he was a black man surrounded by, nearly a football team's worth of white cops. And, about 40 students at Parsons watch as he's beaten into a coma. And wide variety of witnesses in all sorts of different parts of the building, including an aspiring musician on the 7th floor who went by Rob Cummings, but would later be known as Rob Zombie. You see what I mean about the people that get roped into this?
Yeah, you haven't even gotten to like Madonna yet. But so back to the to what the Parsons students witnessed, and it sounds like they were really who you started with when you were reporting. I mean, first I want to say, to make it clear, because of the extent of Stewart's injuries after this beating, you mentioned he's in a coma. He doesn't die right away, and so by the time he passes, 2 weeks later, it's just a lot harder then to piece together what exactly is happening. So that's a challenge, obviously, for investigators at the time in the trial, but it's a challenge too that you face in the book. You've got all of these sort of conflicting accounts, and it's actually very difficult, despite the number of witnesses, to really pin down exactly what happened, like the sequence. So just kind of, if you wouldn't mind, walk us through that reporting process, starting with those students, since they were the first people you talked to. How did you begin to kind of pull these accounts together and make sense of it?
So, it was interesting because they were freshmen. They had been in the city for 2 or 3 days, and they weren't local. They didn't know each other. And even after all those years, unless they were in the same suite, on the same floor, they didn't know each other. So finding them was a little bit of a pain in the ass. I went through the trial coverage. The best coverage, by the way, was written by Isabel Wilkerson for the New York Times, which is kind of remarkable. And, depending on what floor they were on and what side of, some of them were directly facing the park, others were facing 16th Street, which means they could see a little bit of it, but not much. And I was just gathering stories and then looking at, their trial testimony as much as I could. And then the other way I fleshed it out was because they had, they'd all testified in front of a grand jury. Grand jury testimony is sealed. I mean, you don't get to see that. However, there had been later an investigation ordered by the MTA, which is who the police worked for at the time. And so chunks of that testimony ended up in this report, which had been made public and then was on file at the municipal library. So it gave me a lot of room to tell the story.
I'm just curious because, I've also written nonfiction, but it's not nearly as extensively reported. So I'm just curious, did you do all the reporting for this first, or all of the archival research first, or were you sort of was it more like reporting, writing, and then back to reporting? How did you know when to stop? Did you ever stop reporting while you were writing?
It's so funny because there are people that are capable of, I have friends who they'll spend the first half of the process reporting and then the second half of the process writing. And I can't do that because I'll start writing, but then if I hit a part of a paragraph where I have a question, well, then it's back to reporting. Like when I was writing the account of the beating, there was a lot of there were questions later on. Well, how did the students hear as much as they heard from 7 floors up, 8 floors up? One witness was on the 11th floor. And so I interviewed a couple of architects who told me about the canyon effect and about how, because the Union Square was concrete, how the sound would bounce off the concrete and then it would bounce up and off the buildings because there were a lot of tall buildings in Union Square. And so oftentimes you could hear better what was going on at ground level from 8 floors up than you could if you were at ground level yourself. So it was this constant back and forth of, writing, research, interview, and it was that way up till the last day when I got to the end of the epilogue.
I'm trying to think about how to phrase this. I don't something about this story grabbed you, it really compelled you to write it. And it was partly the intersection with, you talk about the artistic and cultural context, which I'll get to in a minute. And partly to the economic and political context in which this happened. But for the people affected, for people who cared about Michael or who didn't know him, like the students, but were impacted by this for the rest of their lives. I can't imagine what it was like for those students to have seen something so young and then not being given a chance to talk about it really until, you came along with this book. But I guess what I'm getting at is, how do you balance that sort of natural curiosity and that responsibility that you clearly feel for Michael Stewart and his story, and also the responsibility to all the people involved who are still deeply emotionally affected?
Well, I mean, with really very few exceptions, we kind of all wanted the same thing. I mean, the book sources, with the exception of people like Bernard Goetz and the arresting officer, I interviewed both of them. They were not pleased that the book was happening. But everybody else was pretty heavily invested. And everybody had been radicalized to various degrees. And it was, one of the most significant events in the life of so many people. And so, it was really oftentimes just a matter of, turning on the recorder and let people talk. It wasn't like with the first book where I had to be really careful not to mess with people's heads because it was a really traumatic thing that they were being asked to relive in a lot of ways. That wasn't the case for some reason this time. It was, I think people were at enough of a remove, but were still so angry about it that they really wanted to talk.
How did the sort of research and reporting process for the first book compare to this one? In other ways, did you find yourself approaching it differently?
It was a lot easier. The first book was, I had the benefit of a trial transcript, and so that sort of provided a natural narrative. It was also the first book I wrote, so I didn't really know what I was doing. And I wasn't as resourceful with, sources of information. I got lucky with a couple of archives, but yeah, I really didn't know what I was doing. And then with this one, I used a researcher who mainly helped just find sources of information. She wasn't doing the reporting, but for example, when I was looking for, I knew that there had been a commission report generated from an investigation into the medical examiner's office. And so she figured out where that was. And her help with the research, her name is Megan Doherty, really just taught me a lot about reporting itself and where information about certain events might be, because that's like half the battle.
You write a lot about the political and sort of financial context for what happened to Michael Stewart. And I don't know, did you expect that going in, that this would also sort of become a story about like a neighborhood that had seen better days, a city that had been on the brink of bankruptcy? I thought you did a really impressive job connecting the dots between public underinvestment in communities and the kind of police crackdowns and brutality that that led to Michael's death. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
I can't take credit for that through line. I mean, the material was always there, but I had an editor named Carrie Fry, who you also know quite well. And she just said one day, like, this is as much a story as anything else. This book is about systemic failure at every level. And I grew to think that, because of the constraints that had been put on the city by the fiscal crisis and the near bankruptcy, that when you took into account the underfunding of the police and their equipment and the degradation of the parks and the ability to light them, and just in general, the entire city basically falling apart, that the killing of Michael Stewart was almost inevitable.
I wanted to ask too about the artistic and cultural environment that you're writing about. I mean, it's right there in the subtitle, Life, Death, and Art in Michael Stewart's New York. So this is very much a story also of New York's art scene in the early 80s. You have this whole artistic community full of strivers like Michael that he's trying to kind of become one of. You talk about the Fab 500, right, that he wanted to be part of. And then after his death, you see, actually even before then, like while he's still in a coma, you see this community, different people kind of rallying around and like holding protests and trying to call for investigation and for justice, whatever justice can be had. How familiar were you with like the role of artists in Michael Stewart's in advocating in their activism for Michael Stewart before you started working on this book? Like, did anything you learned really surprise you there?
Yeah, actually, when I had first read about the case, which was, I think, a Wikipedia entry, the Wikipedia entry mentioned, the involvement of Herring and Basquiat and Madonna. Madonna's involvement, by the way, was Michael was in her first music video for the song Everybody, and she later headlined a benefit for him at Danceteria to raise money for the family who was engaged in a civil suit, and also for hospital bills. But my assumption was that if anything was going to be overstated about the story, it was probably going to be the involvement of the artists, whether it was, Herring or Basquiat. And it was a shock to me to learn that not only had that not been overstated, but that these guys were obsessed and knew the case chapter and verse. The quote that I have that you heard from the prologue is from an unpublished transcript that the Herring estate gave me, and it's just this conversation between Herring and Rene Ricard, the art critic, and like it goes on for about 60 pages, and they're talking about all sorts of things. They're being really catty about Basquiat. They're saying really misogynistic stuff about Brooke Shields because Herring had just done something about Brooke Shields, and they're like bouncing from topic to topic, but they keep coming back to the Stewart case, and they're being really specific about it. They'll talk about, Dr. Gross and, a press conference that he gave after an autopsy. They'll mention the names of the police. I mean, it's like really incredible. Like they were everybody was just keeping such a close eye on this case because it was the first time that they had been personally confronted with police brutality. Until Michael was killed, and this was someone they all knew, it was an abstraction.
You do this really, I don't think this is a spoiler in terms of what happens in the story, but you bring, this art, the threat of these artists and the role of artists too in activism, in commemoration, and building what becomes this collective memory around Michael Stewart and the legacy of what happened to him. You bring that back around and we get more of that, like through the story, through the trial, all the way to the epilogue. You have luminaries like Toni Morrison, and you write about like how like Spike Lee had also engaged with this story. So just talk about like, did you know that going in, that there would be like all these threads that were sort of pulled through, like in terms of this collective memory being built?
I knew some of them, particularly thanks to a Guggenheim exhibit from 2019, and the catalog, lays out a lot of the artistic legacy of the case. But the real big surprises there were the Toni Morrison play, which I had seen referenced in a couple of stories. It was called Dreaming Emmett, and it was staged in January of 1986 to commemorate, to mark the first Martin Luther King Day. And the play was thought to be lost, but it turned out that there were a bunch of different drafts at the library at Princeton in Morrison's papers, and that was quite illuminating. And then I knew that there had been an influence on Do the Right Thing, but until I looked at Spike Lee's journal, which he had published, I think, along with the screenplay, he was influenced by the Stewart case from the very beginning, and mentions Michael not just in dialogue but also in directions in the screenplay itself. And then, part of the Spike Lee story, which had never been part of any kind of narrative, was I was looking through the NAACP archive at the Library of Congress, and they have the civil case files from the lawsuit that the Stewarts eventually won. And I found letters to Spike Lee, both to his personal attorney, but also to Lee himself, after the movie came out, because the Stewarts had not been given a heads up that the movie would be dedicated to, among other people, the family of Michael Stewart. And so they wrote to him, their attorney wrote to him and sort of very politely asked if he would contribute to the legal fund, because civil suits are extremely expensive, and he itemized what exactly was being paid for. And Lee never wrote back. The lawyer never wrote back. He never wrote back. And I spent weeks trying to get a no comment from him and never could.
I wanted to kind of like widen the aperture a bit and talk about like where you sort of see your work or your books, this book in particular, I guess, within a genre of, I don't think of this as like sort of traditional true crime story, right? But crime is here in the form of what happened to Michael Stewart in the police violence, and this trial runs through the book. I'm just curious, like what you think writers need to kind of keep in mind, because I think you treated his story, and you treat the stories in Last Call with like so much care and thoughtfulness, while writing still of really disturbing, traumatic things with such clarity. Like, what do you think writers in this genre are telling stories that touch on these tragic crimes in people's lives need to just kind of keep in mind?
I mean, Last Call, while I think it was unorthodox true crime, because it was, at the time, it seemed unorthodox anyway, because it was extremely victim-centric, and really it's just the stories of the murdered men. But this one, I think, is also true crime, or at least it's true crime as I want it to be. Maybe not what it is, but it is true, and there are crimes committed throughout So I think of it as true crime, but there is no procedural. There is no detective through line, because to the extent that the case was investigated, it was by Robert Morgenthau's, own investigators. But, you know, what I think both books do have in common is that they are only somewhat about the proximate criminal act and mostly about everything else. In the case of Last Call, it's really about the lives of that generation of gay men in Manhattan, but also in other states. And The Man Nobody Killed is just largely, not just about New York, but also just about the epidemic of police brutality, which wasn't at the time being taken very seriously.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears and ask just like kind of a sort of a craft question, more of a writing question. Was there like a particular chapter or scene or just event that almost took you out? Like you didn't know how you were going to manage to write it? Because like it seemed like from start to finish, such a difficult book to write. Like you're trying to thread this needle really carefully and thoughtfully. Like what was the hardest part? How did you kind of move past or move through it?
It's actually the stuff that didn't have much to do with the case itself. So oddly enough, there's a section at the beginning talking about the state of the city and this succession of mayors, LaGuardia and Wagner and Koch, and it's about sort of like the rise and fall of New York essentially, and then where it stands in September of 1983. And that was by far the hardest to write because I just felt like I was like writing an entry in Encyclopedia Britannica or something. It's much harder to make that kind of stuff exciting than it is if someone is getting beaten by police.
You do it really well. Like I thought it was fascinating not knowing very much about like that era of New York history, and then you do it very succinctly, and it's really important context then for what happens, because as you write, this like in a way Michael Stewart's death or the death of someone like him was going to be inevitable in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky that this is not an undercovered time in the city's history. And the city was blessed with incredible tabloid journalists during that period. I mean, Breslin's the most famous, but Jimmy Breslin, but you also had Murray Kempton and Leonard Levitt and all these guys. And so there were just astonishing sources of information and color for the city, but also there were just, because it was such a horrible time, it also generated a lot of investigations, and so then there was all of that was on file. I mean, it wasn't, I think I have a line in that section about how, because there was so little money, New Yorkers themselves had to go into the parks to plant flowers. And I found that in some white paper. And, I had found, it was another one of those things where there was like a single scholarly paper written about the history of Union Square. And the guy who had written it he's now like a hedge fund manager, but he's like written the only paper. And so I interviewed him, and you just never know where you're going to find this stuff.
Was it hard to get anyone you wanted to talk to you?
If I ended up talking to them, it was actually pretty easy. The one that took the most convincing was the chief medical examiner of New York, Elliot Gross, who had never, as far as I can tell, given an interview after he retired. He was always extremely sensitive about this particular case. And
to be clear for the audience, I mean, he was the one who was sort of, I don't know if scapegoated is the right term, but he bore the brunt of a lot of the.
At the time, he was the real target. both of the press, but also of the activism around the case. He was, the chief medical examiner of New York is the most high-profile medical examiner gig. I mean, he can, if it was a really sensitive case, or it would be, or high profile, like he did John Lennon's autopsy, he did Tennessee Williams's autopsy, and he knew that this was going to be a tinderbox of a case, so he did this one as well. And when I first called him, I don't know, we had a conversation, like not on the record, and he didn't seem exactly thrilled, but eventually another doctor who took part in the autopsy kind of vouched for me. And eventually he came around and we ended up talking for several hours over Zoom because he was doing, he's 90 years old and he was doing chemo. So it seemed best to shorten the process a little bit, even though I would much rather have done it in person. But he was a little tough. And then there were people that were initially opposed and like within the same conversation kind of came around. Bernard Goetz is probably the best example of that. Now, if you don't know who he was, and I think it was 84, 85, he took a 44 onto a train and shot 4 black teenagers, not by accident. And there's an excellent podcast about it called Vigilante by Leon Neyfakh. And he would not talk to Leon. And I assumed he was upset about the podcast. So the timing actually worked out. A friend of mine had given me his cell number, and because he does work around Stuytown in Manhattan, disposing of squirrels. I'm not making any of this up. It's bizarre, but that's New York for you. And so I left him a message, and he called me back about a half hour later and yelled at me for about 15 minutes because I was going to write about him. And, when this happens, and it's happened to me a few times over the years where I get yelled at, I try to like short circuit the conversation a little bit to see if I can change the pace. And so I said something about the legalization of weed in New York and about how we had gotten a really good dispensary out on the island. And I don't know if he was just surprised by the change of the conversation, but it kind of messed him up. And so he said, okay, fine, what do you want to know? And then we talked for a good half hour. And I don't know, I was surprised as anybody.
Okay, we're going to go to audience questions in a minute. That's your warning to start thinking of really good questions. But I have like one or two more I'll ask. And one of them is, I think every book, no matter the genre, right, it sort of demands something new of us as writers. I'm curious whether, this book taught you anything about your own work as a writer, or how you want to approach it, or what's most important to you as a writer.
I think I learned that if I can't interview people, I'm just totally fucking miserable. There are people who can write.
You're great at it.
Well, thank you. But it's just like archival stuff definitely has its place, and I'm jealous of people who can do it, but I don't want to live in the stacks, And if I can't call somebody up and say, well, okay, what was on the wall, or how did the bar smell, or what did you see, what did you hear, then it's not fun. Like, to me, the writing is fine. People complain about that sort of thing. I enjoy the writing. I even like the editing because I'm just a sociopath. But
being edited is so fun. It's true. I'm very serious.
No, I know. I do genuinely like it, but it's the interviewing that I really love, and I interviewed about 125 people for the book, and if I had been, given more time or more money, I would interview twice as many people just because I could. Because, you know, being a journalist, while it is mostly downside these days, the upside is that you're in this thoroughly singular position where you have an excuse to essentially call up anybody and ask them anything. And maybe they won't answer you, but you have a legitimate reason to do it. And it's always a wonder to me when people don't take advantage of that.
Okay, if you do have a question for Elon, please, if you're able to come to the microphone and ask it so everyone can hear, that would be great. While you all think about that and decide who's going to be brave and go first, I'll ask you, now that the book's been out for a little bit, just a month or so, right? Have there been any reader reactions that have really meant a lot to you?
Yeah, mostly from the book sources themselves, because while I don't generally think of the reader at all when I'm writing, I do think of the book sources and the family members and loved ones of the book subjects. But it's been really heartening to be told that like I captured Michael pretty well, because it's like it's sort of like the old story about like the blind guys and the elephant, right? I mean, you can interview person after person, but you never know if you're accurately capturing someone who died at the age of 25 in 1983. And with Michael in particular, I was worried because everybody was telling me the same thing. And so I had gone back to some of the sources before the book, before I submitted the draft, and it was just like, if there's a dark side here, I want to know it now. And there just wasn't. So that's been really nice. There have been some lovely responses.
Okay, we have our first.
KT.
You're not supposed to say that you know me. I'm a
I'm
shill.
I'm allowed to brag.
So you're spending years of your life immersed in this story. How do you go about selecting what you're going to write about when it's something like a true crime case? What are the most compelling factors, or what's the biggest factor, or what's a deal breaker? Like you learn this and you're like, this isn't going to work.
Well, so a friend of mine, my late friend David Yaffe, who wrote a biography of Joni Mitchell, he said to me years ago that don't bother writing a book unless you want to do 12 of the longest features you've ever written about the same topic, which is to say chapters. And so at the beginning of any project, I kind of think about it in those terms, like not just do I want to do it, but is there going to be enough material to even sustain, never mind one chapter, but two, because it's very easy to find a good story. And it's easy to find a good story that can make even a good feature. But it's almost impossible to find a story that can make a good nonfiction book, because that requires so much more than the proximate event, than the catalyzing event.
Hi. I might have this wrong, but I think you had mentioned that you read The Alienist over and over to help get the atmosphere for your first book. I wondered if there was anything analogous for this one. What did you steep yourself in?
So that is true about The Alienist. I love that book, and it changed the way I thought about the city, and it set it was kind of stupid to think about it like that, but it set the bar for me for I thought I want to write about the city with like that kind of vividness. With The Man Nobody Killed, I don't really know that I so much had a model like that, but I did want to capture the events with the same vividness that I saw in the tabloids, while not writing like a tabloid reporter, because that doesn't, a tabloid reporter voice in 1983, 84 doesn't really have a place in a book like this in 2025. But yeah, I wanted to be able to capture like the grime of the subway and the broken lights of Union Square Park and the smell of the weed, coming from the park itself, and like all these little details about Manhattan that, made it just extraordinary in those years, whether it was, an artist told me about how when she'd walk down uh, Avenue A, and you'd see all these lines coming out of these burnt out buildings, and those were just people waiting to buy heroin. And I mean, but it wasn't all the, all like dark details. I spent way too long interviewing people for a section about the Pyramid Club that ended up being like 2.5, maybe 2 pages, but I think I probably talked to like 20 people just for that, because this is like a very pivotal location, not just to the book, but just in like the history of the city. And so like when you write a book like this, you have one, this is the one shot. It's not just my one shot, it's anyone's one shot, because people are going to die. And so when people are going to talk to you, they're going to talk to you now, or they never will.
So I imagine when you're speaking to this many people about something like this, there's a lot of conflicting information that gets out there, and maybe I don't know, like stories that that are kind of offshoots of the main story. Is there anything that you wanted to include in the book, but you felt like you couldn't because you couldn't resolve like what happened, or that there was like a thread where it just didn't quite go in the right place to fit in?
No, it's a really good question, and the answer is not really. I did manage to kind of get everything that I wanted to in the book. There were little details about Michael's life, like I knew the name of this girlfriend that he had in London when he had done some modeling work there, and I wanted to write about it, but I couldn't get her to write back to me. And my standard for inclusion in a book is higher than someone told me something. So there were some cases where, well, here's an example. One of the things I don't really address in the book is that nobody really knows which cop did what to Michael. And the attorney for the arresting officer was a bizarrely good source to me. And I've never asked him why, because I don't really care. But so much of the book would not have been possible were it not for some of the stuff he gave me, because it was the highlight of his career. So he saved a lot of material. And one day, as I was walking out the door and had already turned off the tape recorder, he said, "By the way," and then he named one of the officers, they did most of the damage. They really clocked him. And I was like, "Are you going to say that on the record?" He said, "Absolutely not." And so stuff like that is kind of painful to hear, because even if I know something, that's not the same as being able to write about it.
Time for one more question, if anyone has any. Here's one, like it's sort of along similar lines. If there was anything, because again, you write these, both your books, as you say, they're very much centered on the victims and about the people who care about them. Was there anything that you really wanted to learn about Michael Stewart that or
Oh yeah.
that you wanted to explore and couldn't find maybe the information or the right
Well,
source?
yeah. I mean, I didn't talk to his family. It wasn't for lack of trying. I tried to contact them directly, and then eventually I went through the civil attorney who got an answer from them that although they were not against the book being written, they had no desire to talk to me, which I totally understand because very few people actually have an incentive to talk to me. My original idea when writing about Michael Stewart was to write about a history of the Stewarts going back to Williamsburg, South Carolina, which is where the family was from. And then, they were part of the Great Migration going north to Brooklyn in 1955. And yeah, I wanted to tell a much larger story of that family. In the same way with Last Call, one of the victims, Tom Mulcahy, his wife, always struck me as something of the book's hero because she kept the case alive. And I wanted to write an entire chapter about her, but she never talked to me. So you just kind of have to figure out a way in when certain sources are closed off.
All right, well, if there are no more audience questions, I think we could wrap it up. We're almost at time. Thank you again, Elon.
Thank
And
you.
congratulations on the book.